Of all the genres of film I've ever seen, I never expected to add Christian Sci-fi to the list. But why the hell not? So, the newest film out of Angel Studios, who brought us Sound of Freedom earlier this year, and that Jesus show, The Chosen, has brought us a multiverse movie entitled The Shift, which is, of course, based on the biblical story The Job. Now, I'm not going to talk about how accurate it is to the story, because honestly, I don't remember how accurate it is to the story, and honestly, asking a modernized version of a story that's millennia old is kind of pointless, so I'm not even going to get into it. I'm just going to talk about the movie itself. And I've said this before, but nowadays Christian films get a lot more effort put into them. If you watch the video I made, Worst Films from 2011 to 2017, I talked about Left Behind as the worst film of 2014. Even though I probably should have put Kirk Cameron's Saving Christmas on there instead, I went with Left Behind. They're both shitty Christian films, so you can take your pick. Either way, the point is that Christian films used to be extremely shitty. They were low budget, they had no effort put into them, and they almost felt like a mockery of Christianity at times. Especially a lot of the ones that can't come out of, Pure Flix, is that what it's called? Basically, it feels like the Asylum version of Christian films, but I'm not going to get into that any more than I have to, because we're talking about The Shift. And I know this came out weeks and weeks ago, but closest theater that was running this thing was like 20 miles from where I live, so I had to wait for a showing closer to me, and I finally got to see it. So I'm reviewing it now. And side note, I have a lot of reviews to do before I do the best and worst of the year, so I'll probably have 3 tomorrow, and then the everything I missed the day after, and then I'll finally get to the top and bottom 15. So, all that aside, how's The Shift? And I wasn't sure what to expect from this movie because, again, Christian and sci-fi don't really seem like two genres that should ever be put together because, well, they're polar opposites. Isn't science fiction kind of the antithesis of Christianity? But I was still intrigued by what this movie could do. And another knock I had before the movie came out that I was worried about is because I'm so sick of multiverse movies. I've talked about it a few times, but it's true. Multiverse movies used to be a novel concept and used to be done pretty well, but this year alone we got The Flash and Across the Spider-Verse, 2 films that were absolute trash and handled the multiverse extremely poorly by trying to do something new to add to a multiverse, in The Flash being that it also connects to time travel and does it very poorly, and Spider-Verse where it created the canon events, in which case events have to happen in every single universe, which kills the entire point of the multiverse as a whole. But I've talked about that enough, and I will probably bring it up in the bottom 15, so I'm not going to get any further into that. This one is a little bit different. Now, like I said, this is based on the biblical story The Job, and the main character is a guy named Kevin, and after a horrible car accident, he is shifted, which is what they mean for jumping universes in this one, by someone known as the Benefactor, played by Neil McDonough. I think that's how you say it. And he is essentially the devil in this. I don't even think it's implied. I think it's said straight up. I don't remember if it's actually said straight up or if they're just comparing him to it, but it's what he is. And he, of course, offers Kevin to join him and he can have the perfect life that he wants. And in this movie, every other version of Kevin accepted his request except for the one that we're following. And what happens after he resists, he's teleported to some dystopian universe where the majority of the population's wiped out, every place is a shithole, the people survive off rations, and it's basically a dictatorship. Who runs the dictatorship is some mayor that shows up once and he doesn't really do anything. But it's mainly run by, the entire multiverse is basically run by the Benefactor. So, and they pull the Avengers Endgame thing by having him be stuck there for 5 years before the story actually really gets going. Because essentially the first 20 minutes of this is the prologue to what's actually going on. Now, there's a lot of pros with this movie, but there are a couple of cons. And the biggest con for me is that it's a little boring at times. Not to say I wasn't interested in what was happening, and it's not one of those cases where if the movie ended halfway through, I would have been like, okay, whatever. If the movie had ended halfway through, I would have sought out the second half to try to know what happened to everybody. But there were some things that were pretty predictable. For example, Sean Astin's character, I figured he was either going to die or betray Kevin, and he kind of did both. It's a little weird how they did that, and I'll get to that more when I get to the second half of the movie. But I'd say the biggest pro in this movie is Neil McDonough's performance. He is a fantastic actor, and we've all seen the things that he was basically blacklisted by Hollywood because, he's a Christian, and they see Christians as, well, essentially how Christians see the devil, so that's all you need to know there, because I've talked about this so many times. I'm pretty sure I talked about it I'm definitely sure I talked about it in my Sound of Freedom video, so I'm not going to get into it again. But he is the highlight of this movie. The rest of the acting is fine. I'd say the main guy wasn't bad, but I think he needed a few more takes in some scenes. But it was an okay performance. Sean Astin does fine, and he's not in the movie as much as you'd think from how big of a name he is, but he's not. It's like he's a guy you recognize when you see him, but you don't really recognize the name. And again, all the supporting characters are fine. And again, I'm not really sure how accurate this is to the story to the original story, but they do Kevin himself actually talks about the story. So he's basically living through a story that he already knows, which isn't really important. I just thought it was worth bringing up, because he does actually tell the biblical story to a family at some point. So, back to the main plot, he is the only version of himself that resisted the benefactor, because he's basically Job who resisted the devil's offer. That's exactly what this is. And my main problem is that the second act, like I said, is a little boring because not much happens. It's mostly him going around about his daily business, trying to stay hidden from the benefactor, or the benefactor had just straight up disappeared. And then he comes back with about 45 minutes left in the movie, maybe a little less. He shows up, and I will say, not only is Neil McDonough's performance in this really top tier, he has some of the best dialogue. This is what the kind of devil that you would want in a story. He doesn't always have to be the big, imposing threat, the one with the devil horns, or even with the goat head in some iterations. He's very much like Dracula here. He's a master manipulator, and that's exactly what this character is, and McDonough pulls it off perfectly. All of his dialogue actually makes a lot of sense. He's lying. He's kind of lying, but you also know that he's really not. And if that sentence is confusing, well, that's the entire point. He's not exactly lying, but when you make a deal with the devil, well, you kind of get the short end of the stick, and this version of Kevin knows that. He relies heavily on his faith and believes all of his hardships in life have been God's tests instead of the devil shifting people around, until he shows it off later. Although I will say that I know the entire point is that Kevin's not supposed to be the greatest of people, but he kind of becomes one at the end. It's kind of douchey of him when he gets one of the wristbands that jumps between universes. This sounds like it's ripping off Spider-Verse, but considering this movie was probably in production before the movie was released, it's not really the same thing. He finds somebody who the benefactor actually shifted, apparently several times at this point, in a mental hospital after that was the person he shifted to show off that he could actually do it. Finds her in a mental hospital, but doesn't take her with him to another universe. Like, he's like, okay, I don't know how to take you back to wherever you were, but take her out of there or something. Get her out of that freaking mental ward, you dick. And he, of course, when he gets a choice between reuniting with his wife and reuniting her with her family, he chooses to give her family back, and that's the ultimate big decision that earns him a favor from God. And I will say the ending of this was kind of a cop-out, but also not really. It's not one of those things where they erase everything that happens, but okay, the best way I can describe this, there is actually a comparison to another movie that I have seen, one I didn't like, but one I have seen, and it'll probably be a huge what the fuck moment when you hear what the movie is. It's Teen Beach 2. Yeah, if you ever saw the Teen Beach movie on the Disney Channel, that's a movie I legitimately really like, and I plan to do a Diamonds in the Rough episode on that at some point, because it was probably the last good Disney Channel movie. It had a sequel 2 years later, and essentially the ending was everything was reset in reverse. Everything that happened to all the characters was kind of working in reverse. Like, the main characters, Brady and Mac, they're in basically opposite places where they were when they first met, and the movie characters, Tanner and Layla, they're kind of also in the opposite places that they were in the first movie. It does the same thing here, where he was approached by his wife, Molly, at the bar when they first met, but in this version, it's him who approaches her, and instead of a son, they have a daughter and all that other stuff. Oh, speaking of his son, I want to say they never really explain what happened to him, but they kind of do, because he kind of disappears, like, it's almost one of those things like they turn their back for a second and then he's like gone. It's implied that the benefactor shifted him somewhere, but the way the benefactor talks, it sounds like he actually did die, like they thought he did, because he says, "Where your son is, I can't shift him from there," which kind of makes me think that the kid was actually dead, and he can't shift him from either heaven or hell, wherever the kid went. Although I'm pretty sure most children go to heaven, don't they? Isn't there... Because wouldn't most children be like the innocents that... I'm getting bogged down in specifics here. It doesn't really matter. Point is, he kind of disappears, and that's ultimately what kind of drifts him and his wife apart, or at least a version of his wife. It's never really made clear how long he's been living with a alternate version of his wife, or really how many alternate versions. And one thing I did like, when he finally finds his dimension, essentially, he finds his wife, there was also, when he was shifted from there, another version of him took his place, which is what usually happens in these scenarios. Another version of him took his place, and they divorced, and they both, like, met somebody else. And I did like that. I didn't like that he immediately got back with her, or she found somebody because he was gone for... It wasn't like the Thanos snap from Infinity War, where it was like he up and disappeared for 5 years, and all of a sudden reappeared back in this mall right next to her. So I like how they did that. So, I'm trying to clear my verdict. This is a good movie. This is a legitimately good movie, but you probably will find the boredom kind of creeping up during the second act, but it does pay off in the third act, which is legitimately good. I'd say the first act was pretty interesting, the second act was kind of boring, and the third act was legitimately great. So I would say that warrants a score of a B-. I think that seems fair, because it's a good movie, but it's definitely not reaching the A range, because there were some moments that were kind of boring, some dialogue that didn't really work, but the big saving grace of this is Neil McDonald's performance, and the dialogue he is given are some of the highest points of the movie. So yeah, that's all I got for The Shift, and I will see you all next time. Bye!